Welcome to Heat In Tastings, where the secrets of the dojo and the kitchen meet. This podcast is about hidden techniques that are not taught openly. They're reserved for those who've demonstrated deep commitment and understanding to life's arts. These teachings often include subtle principles, strategic nuances, or even spiritual philosophies that aren't visible to just anyone. These techniques, principles, and traditions are sometimes contained in written scrolls and books such as the Moku Roku, that form parts of a formal transmission of kinship or family knowledge. We explore the hidden transmissions behind both culinary and martial mastery. Join the hosts, Coach Bernie Toms and Sensei Dom T. Gallo, as they explore the connection between martial and culinary principles. This episode is part of a multi-part series, so make sure you've listened to the previous episode.
Another point of temperature is the reverse of heat. It's actually cooling something down really quick. So for instance, as you probably know, if you cook something delicate, some sort of shellfish like shrimp that's very sensitive to heat, you'd better have waiting on the side an ice cold water bath, so that after that shrimp, like if you're making a shrimp cocktail, and there's nothing worse than getting a shrimp cocktail where the shrimp are so overcooked, you'd want to bounce them off the walls. They actually have a rubber texture and they're so tough. You want that shrimp, just like scallops or any other type of shellfish, to have a delicate, very moist texture to them. The way you do that is once you drop those shrimp into that simmering water, you're pretty much almost instantaneously going to be pulling them out a few seconds later, and you want to immediately drop those shrimp into an ice cold water bath to cease the cooking process. Because if you do not do that, if you just take those hot shrimp and put them into a plate, that heat is still permeating through that shrimp and it's still cooking it while it rests. Now, that equally is true when you're making a steak or a roast. The resting time is important. So another mistake I see people making is when they take a really good steak or a roast out of the pan or the oven, and next thing, they're immediately looking to slice and carve into it. Big mistake. What you're going to have is a sea of red that's probably going to run down your counter to your floor in your kitchen. And by the way, that red stuff that's coming out of them, it's not blood. So that's another thing that I find interesting, is when people refer to a cut steak or a roast and that red stuff comes out and they go, oh, look how bloody that is. Upon inspection, you will see there are no blood vessels at all in any of those muscles, okay? So that red stuff coming out is not blood. It's actually called myoglobin, which is the protein in any muscle. That's what that red stuff is. So yeah, basically, when you pull that steak or roast out of the pan, out of the oven, off the heat, you want to let it rest for quite a few minutes to allow that myoglobin, those juices, to redistribute evenly throughout the steak or the roast. And usually 15, 20 minutes should be sufficient for that. And then you can safely cut into that steak or roast without ending up with a red mess all over the place. Also bear in mind that when you are cooking something like in an oven, and it tends to be a dish like a lasagna or a casserole type dish, they're going to be extremely hot when you pull it out of the oven. And I would highly recommend that you let it cool down a bit before you serve it to your family and or your guests. Otherwise, they're going to feel like they're eating pyroclastic flow of Mount Vesuvius as they burn their tongues into oblivion. So again, always make sure that something that is very hot coming out of an oven, you let it cool down for a bit. There are cooling racks you could even place these casserole dishes on that will allow airflow underneath them to allow it to cool even faster. But you definitely want to do that so that you don't end up harming anyone, including yourself. The last thing I want to mention about temperature is probably the most unknown to people. So, to the point of hidden secret, chefs know this, but many people that are home cooks may not realize you can use your fridge as actually a prep element or implement. So, let me explain. For instance, if you're going to fry or saute mushrooms, and I'm sure you might have experienced this, many people do. Many people like to wash their mushrooms, which, by the way, is not necessary, but many people like to wash their mushrooms first. They think they're going to end up with like harmful debris or bacteria. So they wash their mushrooms first in water, and then they slice them up and throw them into the pan, especially if the pan hasn't been heated properly, as I was previously mentioning. What you're going to end up with is a mushroom soup. Those mushrooms aren't going to fry, no matter how much fat you've thrown in there, no matter how high the heat is. What you're going to end up having is all of that water moisture leaching out of those mushrooms in the pan, and you're going to be stewing them. You're not going to end up with this beautiful golden brown caramelization to the mushrooms. They're just going to stew in their own juices. And until that all of that moisture evaporates, that's all you're doing is stewing them, and the ending result is going to be terrible. So the first thing you want to do if you wash your mushrooms and then slice them up is place them in the cold of your fridge without a cover on it. The cold of your fridge will suck the moisture right out of those mushrooms. And now you can take those mushrooms, bring them to room temperature, and safely throw them into a hot pan, and you won't end up with all of that water moisture creating mushroom soup. The same thing is true of if you want a crispy texture to chicken wings. I cannot tell you how many times I've seen people take chicken wings that they've washed off or they were just wet to begin with, and they go ahead and throw them into a pan or they throw them in the oven, and they're trying to get this crisp texture to them. But with all that moisture on the surface of the chicken wings, you end up eating like gummy bears. It's terrible. What you need to do is pat those chicken wings as dry as you can get them, and then again, stick them in the fridge uncovered, even overnight, to allow the cold of your fridge to suck the moisture right out of those chicken wings, and you'll end up with a much more desirable, crispy, golden brown texture to them. And again, it's always uncovered, because if you place any covering over them, like plastic wrap or a piece of foil or whatever, it's just going to hold and trap that moisture in. You want to expose the food item to the cold of your fridge's cold air. The other thing that chefs use the cold of a fridge for is many sauces sometimes require what is known as a mount of butter, or a beurre monté, or a mounted butter in the finishing of a sauce to enrich it, thicken it up. So what you would do is cut your butter into tiny cubes, place them in a dish or a bowl, and place them in your fridge until they're ready to be employed. Because if the butter comes to room temperature and is not cold, you will not get the emulsification as you're whisking that butter into your sauce. Now, go ahead, Bern, you were going to say something?
No, just that's a very good point that you're making there. That little hidden point of how you create that sauce using the melting of the butter in a timely fashion like that.
That's right. So if you leave those cubes out and they come to room temperature and too warm, now when you go to add them to that sauce, they're already soft. They're already in a pre-melted state. You're not going to get the right consistency and thickness to your sauce. But when you take that cold cube of butter and it hits that hot sauce, that contrast in temperature actually causes the butter to melt slower as it infuses and emulsifies into the sauce. Remember, this is all chemistry. And once you have it at that right whisking rhythm with that cold butter hitting that hot sauce, again, through the chemical reaction, you end up with a very properly textured sauce. Now, the interesting thing is for egg whites and cream, it's inverse relationships. So if you're going to whip egg whites into a meringue, don't attempt to do that with cold egg whites that you've just taken out of the fridge. Allow those egg whites to come to room temperature. Because if you do not do that, you will not get the maximum amount of volume out of those egg whites. And that's, again, another mistake that I see people making when a recipe they're making calls for egg whites. If they're baking a cake or they're making a meringue, they will take the whites, eggs right out of the fridge, separate the yolk from the white, and then they'll take those cold whites and they want to whip it into a meringue, into soft peaks or even stiff peaks. You won't get that maximum volume if those egg whites have not reached room temperature. By the way, to get maximum volume besides just the temperature of the egg whites, I highly recommend you purchase a copper bowl to whip those egg whites. Again, this is all chemistry. When the egg whites actually hit that copper, it will cause them to be whisked much faster into coagulating into that meringue. It's just a chemical reaction between the copper metal and those egg whites. You could also use, if you don't have a copper bowl, something known as cream of tartar, which you can buy in the spice section of any supermarket. Just add a little bit of cream of tartar to your egg whites. Again, chemical reaction with the egg white and that cream of tartar will cause that coagulation to happen much faster and at greater volume. It's interesting to note, though, for cream, it's the total opposite. I have watched people take heavy cream or whipping cream that was too warm. It's either at room temperature or worse, it's like really warm, and they're trying to whisk it into whipped cream. Especially on a hot summer day, good luck. You'll be whisking until the end of time. If you want to get whipped cream, and I'm telling you, I've watched people take warm whipped cream or room temperature whipped cream and put it in a bowl and take a hand whisk, and they're starting to whisk away, and their arm is going to fall off, and that thing isn't budging. The secret to getting cream whipped into maximum volume and as fast as possibly can so you don't bust your arm is you take the cream, the bowl, and the whisk, stick it into your fridge for a while until it gets really cold, and then whisk, especially on a hot summer day or where the temperature of your house isn't that cool. In a pinch, you can take all of those ingredients and throw them into your freezer. As long as you got enough space in your freezer, you can take the bowl, the whisk, and the cream, drop it into your freezer, leave it there for a few minutes, pull it out. I would say about 15, 20 minutes should do the trick. Pull it out, and you'll be able to whip that cream right up into whipped cream because everything is so cold.
That's really interesting how temperature has such an effect on how we even prepare properly the foods that we eat. That is such an insight, such an insight.
The taste may linger, but the teaching is just beginning. This episode of Heat and Tastings has unfolded in a multi-part series, and what you've just heard is the final layer. If today's episode stirred something in you, be it spice spirit or story, pass it along to someone who'd savor it too. Be sure to return for the next course where we'll deepen the flavor and reveal more of the hidden thread. Until then, keep your knives sharp, your senses open, and remember, it's not just what we consume, but how we connect.